the title of this is, why brain health and memory rejuvenation matter. I think it doesn't take long to reflect that our minds, memory, our consciousness, they're the most intimate part of us and our human incarnation, and contain our whole life story, our relationships with those around us. And it all depends on the brain and how it's functioning. And there's probably nothing more frightening than the idea that somehow that continuity of self and consciousness that we have in this lifetime and our connections to people would be somehow disrupted because we just lose knowledge of who we are, where we are, who we're with. That is very frightening. So the really good news is that memory loss no longer has to happen, and it's no longer such a black box. It's no longer so, generally, it's not like just a stroke of lightning. It hits randomly, but we're beginning to understand many of the processes and mechanisms by which the brain starts shutting down and neuronal function, and therefore cognition and memory begin to be deteriorating and declined. And the good news about it is that a lot of it is actually preventable and even redeemable to a certain degree. And like just about everything in health, the earlier you start, the better the results. So that's why we're also talking about, age 40. And even, one of the first questions that came through the crowdsourcing was, well, what do we do for those of us before 40? And since the changes of Alzheimer's and markers appear as early as 40 years before any symptoms come up, I think there's plenty of room, no matter what age you are, and I am, or we are, that we can make some changes that will positively impact our brain health and therefore help preserve our cognition and our memory and our sense of self. So I have a few slides I wanted to show you just to give a little bit of background. Maybe many of you are familiar with some of these points, but I thought I would just go through and create a little bit of a common foundation and then dive into the many wonderful, excellent questions that you've asked. So I actually started with this about 5 years ago, no, almost 6 years ago now, when I had the great good fortune to meet Dr. Dale Bredesen at a training in the Institute of Functional Medicine. And actually, I met his first patient, best friend first. And she had told me at a dinner, I was just meeting her in San Diego. She told me the story of her best friend and how she had recovered from Alzheimer's. And knowing that I was a doctor, she wanted me to know this, and that I'm an integrative doctor. I didn't just brush it off as some kind of impossibility or couldn't have been right or the diagnosis must have been wrong. But I was inspired, but in a cautiously optimistic way, because really I didn't know how that had happened and I wasn't being empowered. So anyway, I did some training. I was fortunate enough 6 months later to do training in this methodology, and I've been using it with patients since then. A number, probably somewhere between 50 and 100 patients. And the results are sort of bell-shaped curve, as you can imagine, but it's not as hopeless as it used to be. And many people have had really good results. And we can see the influence of catching things early and really following a comprehensive approach to sustain memory as well as to help recover it. We all know that Alzheimer's disease is a global epidemic. It's the fifth leading cause of death for US women. It's the number one cause of death in women in the UK. And 2/3 of dementia patients are women. And this incidence increases, as we know, sharply with age. And after 85 years, a depressingly 50% of people have dementia. Currently, there is no known so-called cure. The medications that exist tend to be very limited in their effect. Maybe they slow progression for about 6 months. Some are actually being cited as creating more harm than good in the long run. And these new super expensive monoclonal antibody drugs are of questionable effectiveness in actually improving cognition. Then they have serious side effects, even though they do get rid of amyloid. So here we have our beautiful brain and the hippocampus deep within the central part of the brain in the hippocampus. And that is something that we want to protect, and we don't want it to shrink up as we get older. This would be example from left to right of the brain becoming less in volume. We want to nourish the brain so it stays nice and full as possible. This represents a lot of neuronal loss. So what causes Alzheimer's disease? Beta amyloid deposits is said cause Alzheimer's. Tau tangles within the cells cause Alzheimer's, but really those are just the hallmark pathological features. We really don't know what causes those things to build up. And in integrative medicine, as you know, and Ayurveda and all natural approaches, we ask the question, what is causing this? What can we do? So here is the schematic of tau tangles within the cell. You can see that these shrotas, those of you who know Ayurveda, this would be shrotas, these channels have gotten, and passageways have gotten all tangled. And then outside between the cells, in the extracellular space, big clumps of this beta amyloid, which then disrupt the conduction along dendrites and axons, and eventually cause the neurons to degenerate and then basically die off. So these were just some headlines I pulled out of the news in the last few years, like, is Alzheimer's an infection? For example, like herpes simplex virus, or could it be Lyme, chronic Lyme? Is Alzheimer's diabetes of the brain? That type 3 diabetes is now the name of this phenomenon. Does air pollution cause Alzheimer's? Is Alzheimer's caused by a virus? Is it caused by inflammation? Well, they all may play a role in different degrees in different people, and many other mechanisms and theories abound. This is Dr. Dale Bredesen. He is the, really, I would say, the pioneer of the integrative approach and applying it in a clinical setting. And he actually has spent his life studying in the lab at the Buck Institute of Aging, primarily as a bench scientist, just looking for that magic drug that's going to cure Alzheimer's. And after several decades in his career looking for it, having drug after drug that looked great in mice and then did not translate into really helpful in humans, Dr. Ramhan Rao, one of his associates in the lab, and others said, hey, there's a lot of research on all sorts of natural stuff coming out, from, exercise to diet to supplements to herbs and spices. Maybe we should look at that. And eventually they got to him and he said, yeah, okay, so let's put it all up on the wall. Every study you can find, let's look at it and try to figure out what way forward might work. And so he basically said, we should do it all. We need a comprehensive approach. So this was his first paper, published in 2014, when he documented 10 patients that he had applied this model of optimizing metabolism, nutrition, reducing inflammation, optimizing blood sugar, optimizing nutrients and hormones, and addressing any infections, et cetera, et cetera. And he found really impressive results. When I got very inspired when he presented this data on a particular patient, showed in the beginning baseline fasting insulin 32, that's like diabetic or close to it. That's very high resistance, insulin resistance. High inflammation, almost 10. I mean, you want to see HSCRP ideally less than 1. Homocysteine, which is also pro-inflammatory, vitamin D deficiency, struggling. He was somebody who used to be able to add 2 rows of numbers in his head, many, many numbers. He couldn't remember his locker combination at the gym. And his hippocampus was 17th percentile size for his age. Well, he did this protocol for not even a year, and all of his metabolic markers dramatically improved. And his symptoms went basically away, went back to working full time. And his hippocampal volume, this was what got me. Oh, it went from 17th percentile to 75th percentile. It basically grew back. That really was impressive to me, that we had some objective anatomical data that showed that things are really reversing in the brain. Then he went on with some other clinicians to collect data on 100 patients being treated by doctors trained in his protocol. And then the most recent, published just last year, Precision Medicine Approach to Alzheimer's Disease, a successful pilot project. This was done on 25 participants. They were not randomized. It wasn't controlled. The control was the average, that general population of people with this mild cognitive impairment condition would go through in that 9 months. He applied his comprehensive approach. 84% of the participants improved cognitively, and as far as their MRI went, improved as well. So now they are going to do a multi-center trial, and they are going to randomize it, which is really great. We want to keep upping the quality of the data. So this was the average cognitive scores and the percentile when the 25 participants started, and you said they went from below the 40th percentile for their age to up closer to the 66th percentile. So as opposed to no treatment or with these expensive drugs, the change in cognitive score that would have been expected in that time period would have been some decline, and instead they had an improvement. And the MRI expected drop of 2.2% per year. And these people actually gained gray matter. Gray matter are the cell bodies, the neurons, the neuronal bodies themselves. So that was a very significant improvement for a 9-month period. And the hippocampus, it still was declining slightly, but at a rate about, 2/3 less than it would have otherwise been expected to. I won't go into all this detail, but it's very interesting that there is one molecule that we can look at that in a healthy brain, this beta amyloid precursor molecule, the precursor protein to beta amyloid, it sticks in the cells. It spans from the extracellular space through the cell membrane into the intracellular space. And it responds to the environment. It's very epigenetically triggered. So if it's a healthy environment, really good, healthy nutrients coming in and low inflammation and all that, this thing can cleave into two, and it actually supports the growth of new neurons. But if it's a bad environment or challenging environment or infection or inflammation or lack of nutrition or lack of stimulation or stress or cortisol or imbalances in hormones, et cetera, then this same molecule gets cleaved differently by enzymes. And it goes on to make these beta amyloid fibrils that can accumulate. And it's not, I think Dr. Bredeson's approach and other experts are saying, amyloid's a response of the body and the brain to challenge. And it's actually meant to be a protective response. But if it's in excess, then too much builds up. Those of you who know Ayurveda, I like to think of it as beta amyloid. Ama is, waste, impurities and things that build up, and then they clog the spaces and the channels in the body. And that's what Ayurveda says is basically the root, one of the first steps of physiological imbalance that leads to disease after the doshas. So it's kind of like a barometer. That's how I look at it. This precursor protein, is the weather's going, going to be good, then it goes this way and everything grows. If the weather's starting to be bad, then it goes this way and everything kind of contracts. And our diet, as we said, epigenetically, diet, lifestyle have a huge impact. So we always want to be favoring these plastic looking fruits, but at least they look better than this guy over here. Now, why drugs haven't worked? Well, you'd think, well, can't we just get a drug that'll push this molecule in one direction, the good direction? Well, actually, there's, dozens of factors that influence this molecule. If you just take one biochemical, pathway or mechanism out here, you just can't do it, because you can't effectively block this going to the so-called bad guy, because there's just too many factors. One active ingredient or active method is not going to do it. So it's all about balance. I think about, this is Ayurveda saying, of course, balance is the key to perfect health. I also think about the work of Dean Ornish, and with heart disease and also with prostate cancer. Probably about 15 years ago, he did a study on prostate cancer and diet and lifestyle. And what he found was, when he applied a specific, anti-inflammatory diet, healthy lifestyle, stress reduction, and all of that to cancer patients, prostate cancer patients, there were dozens of health promoting genes that were turned on, and many dozens of health or disease promoting that were actually turned off. It was very widespread effect on the genome. And I'd say the same thing for what we're learning about the brain and about health in general. It's not just one thing. So the old model is beta amyloid or tau tangles are the cause. It just happens. We don't know why. There's no cure. And maybe giving drugs like these $26,000 a year drugs that get rid of beta amyloid, maybe that'll cure it. Well, it doesn't. And this is not the first time drugs like that have been used. Now, the prevailing integrative approach is no one loses memory for no reason. So if somebody's losing memory, if we look hard enough, we can find modifiable factors that can potentially help them stop the decline and turn it around. So fix enough of them and people get better. So here are a few of the major ones. Underlying drivers of this kind of disease: type 1, inflammation, which in my experience, mostly diet, huge factor for inflammation. Also stress, also things like injuries, but primarily this is very diet modulated. And my patients who come to me and they're following a really healthy, mainly plant-based diet, whole foods, is favoring organic, almost always their inflammatory markers are perfect. They're good. So at least the overt kind that's in the bloodstream. Type 1.5 is sugar, insulin resistance, the whole type 2 diabetes thing. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Type 2 atrophy, meaning just not the hormones and the nutrients that the brain needs to flourish and have growth enhanced versus atrophy or decline. I think of a plant, if you're not giving the plant, you got to give it water. If it's looking a little peaked, you got to give it Miracle Grow. You got to give it nutrients and make the soil nourishing. And then the plant starts to grow like crazy. It's a simple analogy, but really we have to give the body enough nutrition and proper nutrition, hormones, etc. Type 3, toxic. This is a pretty unknown field that those of us doctors who work in this area, we're finding is a huge and very challenging area to turn around. But there are people who are getting exposed to mold. Maybe they know it, maybe they don't. Chemicals from the mold, mycotoxins, are building up in their system, and many of them are neurotoxins. There can be also hidden infections. There can be, even Lyme and herpes virus. It used to be syphilis that we were looking for. We still should look for that. Actually, one patient came to me who did have test positive for that. chemicals as well. We could go into details. We want to save time for your questions. Vascular dementia is another thing. You need blood flow to the brain. And if there's narrowing and a lot of plaque in the arteries, and there start to be mini strokes, or you lose white matter in the brain, that is a big cause of dementia. And traumatic dementia, even, whether it's PTSD from an emotional trauma, stress, or a physical trauma, head injuries, the, famous kind of football injuries with lots of trauma to the head. So this precision approach involves, first of all, a lot of blood tests, cognoscopy. Dr. Bredesen playfully calls it that. And this would be personalizing diet and eating habits. Some of it's general, but some of it's personalized, and supplements also personalized to optimize metabolism. It's as goes metabolism, so goes cognition. Stress reduction, gut health, optimize hormone levels. If women are very deficient in estradiol, which is a very beneficial hormone for the brain, newer research and further analysis from the Women's Health Initiative have brought to light a lot of important revelations about safety versus lack of safety of taking hormone therapy, hormone replacement after menopause. And in many cases now, certainly doctors working in this field are favoring starting women on these hormones, especially if they have very low levels. Some women will test like non-existent. It doesn't even measure on the blood test. Brain HQ, that's an example of a documented evidence-based brain training online, brainhq.com. Sleep hygiene, sleep is key. Physical exercise, probably the most benefits come from that, or the most evidence we have are about the benefits of physical exercise. Sleep apnea, treating that. Oxygen to the brain is essential, getting deep sleep and good sleep. And then especially if a person shows that they have toxins, removing the toxins, removing exposure to the toxins, the mold, for example, is critical. Oops. And if there's autoimmunity, that's can be a factor in some people as well. So I just wanted to briefly show that women going through menopause, this was cross-sectional groups of women at various ages going through the premenopause to the postmenopause. And you see red is good. Red is healthy metabolism. It correlates with good blood flow and oxygen use, and this is a very healthy looking brain. You can see just entering perimenopause, perhaps the first 2, 3, 4, 5 years of going through this transition, there's a dramatic decline in the amount of metabolism. And then even in the postmenopause, you can see again some continued decline. So some of the research is indicating it may be useful, especially in the perimenopausal time, to supplement with hormones. It may prove to be beneficial also for the heart as well as the brain. But they're bioidentical hormones. They're given estradiol only through the skin, and progesterone is never given as the medroxyprogesterone, which a lot of the side effects found in Women's Health Initiative were actually attributable to that fake or artificial progesterone. So we see here that men do not go through the same kind of thing. Baseline and 3 years at those age groups look pretty much the same. So this is getting near the end here. Top 10 tips for your memory. We'll go into some more of this as the questions come up, but generally, the whole food, plant-based diet, fresh fruits and vegetables, berries, olive oil. Follow the keto flex. Keto means, not necessarily super strict keto, but at least fasting for 12 hours minimum, no late night snacking, no late night dinners, have at least 3 hours before you go to sleep that you're not consuming any calories. You can drink water or herbal teas, but nothing with calories, so that your body can transition into a fasting state more easily and isn't trying to digest and deliver nutrients at a time during sleep when the lymphatic system, the glial cells and the lymphatics of the brain are opening up and flushing out impurities. We don't want to bring in the groceries when we're trying to clean the kitchen. So reduce and avoid the refined carbs, sugar, everything that will reduce your insulin sensitivity over time. Fast at least 12 hours. So from the time you eat your dinner, finish your dinner till you eat in the morning should be at least 12 hours. And depending on your genetics, it may be even beneficial to have it be at least 14 or 16 hours. We can talk a bit about that in a little bit. Eliminate the bad fats and processed foods. And what do we have here? Number 5 got lost. Let's see, I can't see it. There we go. Tame your inflammation. Yeah, that healthy diet basically up here. Turmeric can also be of help. Omega-3s can help with that. And exercise. Exercise has the most evidence so far for being beneficial. There's lots of studies on it. Some of the most useful I found were one study 5 or 6 years ago looked at all sorts of exercise studies on dementia occurrence and incidence, and they found that they said it didn't really matter what type of exercise or the schedule of it, but if the person did a cumulative amount of at least 2 hours a week, that had a beneficial effect. There have been some studies on how many steps a day. Those of you who aim for 10,000 and get them most of the time, you have a 50% less risk of dementia. And that was a follow-up study of 7 years. If you walk with purpose, kind of more fast and quick, you can get away with 63:15, and even 3,800 steps a day, just walking around, can lower your risk by 25%. Weight training is also highly protective, increases your lean body mass, reduces frailty, which is also a risk factor for Alzheimer's, and it promotes BDNF, which is the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which stimulates the growth of new neurons, which they taught us in medical school quite a while ago that didn't happen, but now we know it does. We create new neurons every day. We're doing something new or exercising. So learning something new is also a fabulous way to promote the growth of new connections and new neurons. And it can be a musical instrument, it could be a language, it could be anything that you enjoy. And I was heartened to learn that the studies show you don't have to get good at the language, just trying to learn it helps. So optimize your nutrients and hormone balance. These are things that all need to be checked as blood levels. And we're going to talk a little more about thyroid. There were a lot of questions on that. Social contact and connection is turning out to be a very big factor. And a very interesting study found that of many types of social connection, and even like in a close relationship, that having someone who will give you supportive listening, be a supportive listener that allows you to express yourself and listens in a positive way, that was more powerful even than love and affection. That was really a remarkable finding. So, and also just some other practical things. Control your blood pressure. Take your medication if you have high blood pressure, even if it's not great, if it's 140 or 145, that's too high. Even 135 in midlife consistently can increase your risk of dementia later in life, not to mention stroke and heart problems. And I added here, avoid anticholinergic medications whenever possible. Acetylcholine is a major neurotransmitter in the brain that's involved in our learning and memory. And drugs that interfere with that can affect memory. In fact, I had one patient who was so severely reactive and allergic, evidently, I say allergic, not in an immune sense necessarily, but she actually had transient global amnesia from taking a common over-the-counter allergy medicine that was antihistamine and anticholinergic. So Ayurveda, everyone here probably is familiar somewhat with it, and beautiful traditional health system of India and meaning really knowledge of life. And I'm going to end with just a snippet from one of my patients. This is a lady who's a social worker, and she came to see me because she was starting to have trouble with her cognition. And I'm going to just play a little bit about what she said. The thing was, she came to see me, and because she knew Ayurveda a bit, and she meditated and everything. So I said, okay, well, I'm going to take your pulse. And, I found immediately it was what we would say in Ayurveda, a lot of impurities in the blood and just aggravated pitta impurities, toxic ama, we could say, a lot of free radicals, a lot of inflammation. And so I said, really, we're going to do all those blood tests and check all your hormones and nutrients and all that. But really, it's really clear already that it must be, your diet needs an overhaul. And she said, I will do whatever you tell me. And I gave her recommendations for some herbs and definitely a dietary overhaul. And she followed it. She came back, and I asked her, since she had such dramatic results, I asked her if she'd share it, and she was happy to do so. So here she's just saying what happened to her. She was a social worker. She was still working full time. She was giving training sessions, and she was finding that she was forgetting words during trainings, having to ask the audience to fill in a word for her. She was having trouble at the computer transferring a few digits to another screen. She would forget in the meantime. She forgot that she and her daughter had read a book 6 months ago together, read the whole book, and then she was reading it again. And her daughter said, "What are you doing, Mom?" She didn't remember having read it. So things were definitely going downhill. But I'm going to cut a little bit to the end. And this is only from her change in diet when she first came back, and lifestyle.
Transpose those numbers in the computer from one place to another. I was remembering them rather than having to write them down. It wasn't difficult to remember words anymore. When I was in conversation with family or friends, or even in the trainings, and I would just begin to recognize and see that, and I was going, this is incredible. This is absolutely incredible. One of the things that I noticed was my sleep patterns. Before, I would go to bed 10:30 at night, and I would sleep in the morning until as late as anybody, as long as they left me alone. And then I would wake up, and I'd be very groggy, not alert. And I used to say I might get up at 7, but I'm not awake until about 10, because I just didn't have that alertness. But I noticed that I was always in bed before 10. Now I wake up at 6 without an alarm clock. I'm alert. I'm ready to go for the day, and I'm bright and just so different than the patterns that were there before. So I'm seeing a lot. My mood has changed. I'm much happier, lighter, laugh more, not as dull. I think I'm much more lucid all the way across so many parameters of my life. Just so thrilled.